Wonderful. Thank you, Pirooz. And also in the background, not visible, well, visible standing against the mountainscape is Nemanja Mitrovic, who's done so much to make all of this possible. Thanks to Nemanja, and thanks to Pirooz also, who's instrumental in this series that we have created now. We call it an open lecture series. It's been, I suppose, like so many, we're improvising right now, so we're developing a new program, and so this is the second in the series. We have a couple more coming. I want to, you can always look to Instagram for the announcements, but on July 1st, we have Carlos Amorales, and then on July 15th, we have Judith Butler. And then I should mention that on the 24th, I think it is, 24th and 25th, we begin our summer session, which should have been in Bergamo, but is continues online. And I want to mention that for those of you who may not be aware of this, it's possible to audit these seminars online. Of course, you can join us as a matriculated student, but we do have an auditing option, and you can look on our website to learn more about that. It's at a very nice discount, I might say. So we are getting started then today with two speakers together, Terri Geis and Manthia Diawara. Terri is now joining us. She has recently served as a curator of academic engagement at Pomona College. And prior to this, she was working as a curator of academic programs and then also director of education and interpretation at the Fowler Museum at UCLA. And let me invite you to look at her faculty profile on the EGS website, because she has a very impressive list of accomplishments and writings there. So please take a look at that. I don't want to use a lot of time in rehearsing those, but it's really very interesting. And yeah, I think I definitely, please go to that immediately after this talk. She co-curated with Manthia 2 years ago, I guess, an exhibition and film project entitled Exquisite Corpses, Ted Jones. And she's done extensive work on photography, on women artists in Latin America. And well, again, I send you to our website. It's a rich background. And she works in this, I think, extremely important area of a relation between museums and the academy, which is, it's complex. And she has negotiated that space very, very nicely, I think. Now, Manthia Diawara is well known to the EGS community. Again, if you would like to consult his profile, we have that up on the website. But he's a professor of cultural theory and film at the EGS. And I won't rehearse his series of accomplishments, which are many, but I just want to mention that in recent years, Manthia has been instrumental in helping us undertake a series of seminars and coming projects, I should say, on radical Black thought and the history of that thinking. And this has been, for me, it's a tremendously important dimension of our current work, and I want to thank Manthia for that. But he's also been teaching on Édouard Glissant in particular in recent years. Has been joining a few other seminars with me on this topic of radical Black thought, but I want to mention that his contributions on Glissant have been especially rich, and we'll be hearing again, I think, a little bit about Glissant today as they begin this presentation, which I had a glimpse of in a published version on the topic of the sacred. I found it incredibly engaging, so I thought it would be very nice if they shared this with us. And so I will pass the floor to them then, and I look forward to this with the rest of you. Thank you very much, Terri. Thank you, Manthia, for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Chris, and to everyone at EGS, Nemanja. The EGS team has been so gracious to invite us to give this talk in this interesting new format that you all are working on. Do you want to say anything before I?
No, I think you should go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're going
All
to say
right.
everything for us. So.
So, as Chris mentioned, this talk kind of comes out of the ideas of an article that Manthia and I co-wrote on the new sacred for the Barbier Mueller Museum's Arts and Cultures Journal. And together we started, for this article, discussing some ideas around the sacred, drawn from the work that I had done over the years on surrealism, and specifically working with André Breton, and Manthia's work, extensive work on Édouard Glissant. And we started to try to think about intersections between these two areas and points of connection and ways that we could draw out some new concepts on the idea of the sacred, but from new perspectives. And so we were thinking with some of the work that I've done on Breton and the Americas and his concepts of the marvelous and how these evolve as he comes to the Americas in the 1940s, and working also with Glissant's concepts of relationality. And we're looking to the new sacred to create a pact between nature, humans, non-humans. We really started to see this as a continuity in the work that they had both done. And through this, we wanted to propose a new sacred as reinvesting spirituality in the human hand and in interconnectedness. Something that draws upon traces of sacred traditions, but opens out towards the future and towards everyone. So instead of looking through esoteric information that requires initiation and stays within a closed community, this is looking at traces of something sacred, but giving access to it as an intersecting meeting point for the world. Would you agree with that synopsis? So what I would like to do is talk briefly about Breton and how this manifests for him in the visual art. And this is something that we very much explore in the article. As I mentioned, central to his work is really this concept of the marvelous, which, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, it's a renunciation of rationality, a move towards wonder, and very adamantly a denouncement of capitalist alienation. During his exile in the US during World War II, Breton reached a deeper phase of anti-colonial and anti-racist work that had always been a part of surrealism and inherent to his concepts of the marvelous and his group's exhibition strategies and manifestos and texts. But this really becomes foregrounded in the 1940s, and he becomes very closely connected with artists of the African diaspora and foregrounded them at this point within surrealism's goals of defiance against repression, the goals of a movement towards collectivity, and increasingly the concepts of healing and redemption, which become so central to his thinking and the group's thinking, based upon the circumstances that they found themselves in as exiles during this time. So at this point, let me pull up our slide presentation. Bear with me. Just have to share the screen. Can you all see that? Hopefully.
I think they're muted, but they probably can.
Okay. So Breton's passage through Martinique on his way to the United States and their meeting with Suzanne and Aimé Césaire are kind of central to what I'm talking about, and the turn at this time towards these concepts of the marvelous and the African diaspora. And nature, very specifically the forest, or what they term the jungle, are also very much intrinsic to this connection. Breton walks with the Césaires in the Martinican Absalon forest, and they encounter a heliconia flower, which is this red tropical plant which blossoms like a natural sculpture, nourishes hummingbirds as they pass from branch to branch and flower to flower. And he was very much inspired by this encounter with this plant, and he marks it as an example of wonder, an example of fixation on the landscape. And I'm quoting him: "Let us symbolically raise up the heliconia flower, flowing with blood from the lowest to the highest life forms. May the flower be emblematic of the reconciliation we are seeking between the obtainable and the wild, between life and the dream." So Breton is really exploring the marvelous in this way, embedded in the landscape of the Americas. And this is something that very much could also be termed the sacred. I think the marvelous and the sacred for Breton, although he generally uses the marvelous more often, they're interchangeable concepts in the way that we're using these. So I want to discuss a couple of the visual artists of the African diaspora that Breton closely allied himself with during this time, and who he viewed as forwarding the sacred. We really started to think through the aesthetic vision of this as both Breton and Glissant write about this. And interestingly enough, of course, these are artists that also very closely ally themselves with Surrealism and exhibit with the Surrealists, consistently either talk about their affiliation with the movement or their membership with the movement. So these are artists that are very much within this realm. As Manthia and I discovered, these are also the artists that Glissant closely connected with and wrote about in his Caribbean discourse. So one of the artists is Augustin Cardenas, who you see here in his studio in the photo on the right, and a sculpture of his on the left. He's a Cuban sculptor that became affiliated with Surrealism by the 1950s. He was strongly influenced in and informed in his work by the sacred arts of West Africa, most specifically the Dogon of Mali. His own heritage he traced to Senegal and to the Congo. Breton lived amongst Cardenas's sculptures, including the piece that we're showing on the left-hand side, which is a piece that sits now in the Pompidou as part of Breton's famous wall, which we can also discuss later if you like. So this is a piece that's untitled from around 1955. And ruminating on Cardenas's art practice, Breton suggested that it subverted technological alienation. So again, this movement towards the organic, towards the natural, and that the sculptures represented the human hand returned to their sacred functions. And Breton reflected that Cardenas's fingers were, and I quote, like great flowering totems. So this idea of nature, the idea of the totem, the idea of that which is made by hand and which connects one to others are all very, very crucial here. Like Breton, Glissant connected with Cardenas and lived amongst his sculptures, including these two pieces that you're seeing. One is a piece in burnt ebony on the right-hand side, which is called History is Not Finished, number 3. And the other work is very much inspired by the elongated vertical forms of the Dogon of Mali. And the work on the left is entitled Totem. The original cover of Glissant's Caribbean Discourse featured a drawing by Cardenas, which I think very much indicates the role that the Cardenas' aesthetics were playing in Glissant's ideas. Glissant actually wrote an essay on Cardenas in the book, which was called 7 Landscapes for the Sculptures of Cardenas. And here he reflects on their visit together to the Absalon forest in Martinique. So the same space that Breton moves through with the Césaires in the 1940s, Cardenas and Glissant later visit together as well. And Glissant animates this landscape and its living pulse, and he notes that Cardenas comes to this forest in part, and I quote, to see where the heliconia grows, whose 3 times heaving heart was examined by André Breton. So it's these wonderful repetitions of the past meeting the present as artists and philosophers and poets and writers start to try to envision the future and a collective future and a vision of the future that brings the world together. Glissant speaks of the ways in which Cardenas' work, and I quote, assembles the memory of the future. So it's the past and the present and the future embodied in the landscape and embodied within this artwork. And I would also say that in this idea, the sacred is something that is in this art, and it's not fixed, but it's consistently evolving and moving. The second artist I want to briefly mention is Wilfredo Lam, who I'm sure is perhaps more familiar to some of you than perhaps Cardenas' work is. Lam is such a major figure of 20th century art, Cuban painter, also very closely connected with Breton and Glissant and their ideas of the sacred. Lam engages with the imagery of Santeria and other Afro-Caribbean religions, although it doesn't appear that he himself was an initiate of any of those, but the imagery makes its way into his work very, very strongly. The painting on the screen is The Jungle from 1943. And this is a very, very large canvas. Some of you may have seen this in person in various exhibitions, or it's part of the permanent collection of MoMA in New York. And what you have here is figures that are emerging and merging with this dense landscape of what Lam terms the jungle. And the figures are both interconnected, connected to their landscape, but there's also a sense of defiance and perhaps uprising. On the right-hand upper corner, perhaps you can see that there's a hand that's wielding a sharp pair of scissors. Lam himself commented on this piece, which is always so wonderful to reflect on what an artist themselves say about a work. And what he said was that this was indeed a space of defiance and troubled history. He describes the scissors in the work as, and I quote, a symbol of a necessary cut against foreign imposition in Cuba, against all colonization. Breton and Lam were very, very close colleagues who actually had traveled together in that journey to Martinique on their way into exile in the Americas. Lam had previously been in Paris before making his way back to the Americas and eventually back to Cuba. And in 1946, the two of them visited Haiti together. And it's here that Breton wrote an essay, a very poetic short essay about Lam, speaking of his work as an ever-changing, ever-moving, ever-connecting cycle and process. And I want to read this quote to you. He writes, "It is still trembling as though it had been weighed on the scales of the leaves. It is a vital force that seeks out the tree of mystery, which is the human race's unvanquished soul, and sprinkles with stars the slowly growing shape of humanity's well-being." Glissant also wrote about Lam in the Caribbean Discourse, and for another edition of the book, used an image, a work of lambs for the cover. Glissant, more generally in Caribbean discourse, reflects that the landscape retains the memory of time past. And speaking very specifically about Lam's painting, he says that it represents the poetics of the American landscape: accumulation, expansion, force of the past, the African connection, and the presence of totems. And finally, before I hand it over to Manthia, I want to talk a little bit about the work of the poet and visual artist Ted Jones, who's pictured here in this slide with André Breton at Breton's apartment in Paris in the early 1960s. Jones was a US expat who for years had moved between Paris and Timbuktu in Mali, amongst many other places. His letters from the 1960s to Breton indicate his desire to present surrealism as intrinsic to Black culture, rather than, as the movement has sometimes been discussed or accused, rather than predatory on Black culture. To give an example, this is a page out of a journal that Jones did in the 1980s when he was in residency in Berlin. And on this page and throughout the other journal pages, Jones maintains this strong allegiance with Breton and Surrealism and connects them with anti-colonialism as well as African arts. As hopefully you can make out on this page on the bottom, there's a couple of images of Ghanaian Nimba sculptures, a goddess of fecundity, representing the female spirit of fertility. And Jones juxtaposes this with a quote from Breton, the quote of which urges the creation of a new myth, taking man to his ultimate destination. And this, Breton states, is Surrealism's great rendezvous with history. With Jones, the new sacred manifests most strongly through his use of the surrealist mode of the exquisite corpse. And Jones maximizes this as a means of connection between groups of people coming from all over the world. As I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the exquisite corpse is this method of creating automatic drawings that have as their central characteristic lack of ownership or authorship by one person, but also this sense of surprise in terms of what the ultimate result is. So you fold a piece of paper, someone draws in the first folded square, and then the next person continues on the next folded square without seeing what the first person drew, and they continue on like this. Usually they're done with 3 or 4 people, and then the drawing is unfolded, and surprise ensues when people see how the other person drew in something attached to their original drawing. This exquisite corpse, which is up on the screen right now, beautifully brings together some of the artists that I've been talking about. So this is an exquisite corpse that Jones created with Wilfredo Lam and Agustin Cardenas. And it also includes a number of other artists, including Jorge Camacho, a Cuban artist, Roberto Mata, Chilean, Hervé Telemaque, a Haitian artist who was based in Paris. And poetry was written about the piece by the Egyptian-French writer Joyce Mansour. And this piece is called The Seven Sons of L'Outremont and His Dutiful, Beautiful Daughter. So with this, I think that Jones and his other artist colleagues that I've been talking about really take some of the surrealist concepts that they've learned and admired through Breton and perhaps some other French writers and painters. And they've moved this quite interesting into different spaces and contexts, creating really new visions of interconnected aesthetics and sacred practices. The artists that I've been talking about are connected to sacred concepts, the Dogon religion, Santeria, the Ghanaian Nimba that Jones addresses. but expressed in terms of modernism. So they're referring to these sacred sources, but looking from past to present to future at the same time. And so this is really about relation as so demonstrated in this Exquisite Corpse collective work. And that's a good point to segue over to Manthia to continue the conversation.
Wishing that you would just go on and we'll run out of time. Yes, so Terry has presented really the gist of the article we did for the Barbier-Muller Museum, their magazine called Art and Culture. They were originally the people who asked us to write the paper, which at some point I would love to put on EGS website, but I don't know how possible that is. But meanwhile, you can just go to, Barbier-Muller is in Geneva, and they have a magazine called Art and Culture. So what I'm gonna try to do is to give some more examples from what Terry had just said in order to hopefully give you more definitions of the sacred. What is sacred about the new sacred? This question came to me, and this is why I feel like I have to attempt to respond. In Sharjah, one year I was giving a talk, and a person in the audience asked me, what is the new sacred for Glissant? What does he mean by the new sacred? So hopefully some of the examples that I will give here would help. I think Terry had already talked about the resistance to capitalist alienation. One could add to that also some of aspects like the attempt to look for the landscape as character, not as decoration, but as character. And also, I think politically, both the Surrealists and the Afro-diasporic writers at first, they were going against rooted identities and how to define the sacred that is not couched in the myth. And as you know, the myth usually hides something that it sends you to find. So myths usually have origins, or always have origins that you have to find. And Glissant, I'm sure the Surrealist theory could tell us more about this. We're trying to find stories that do not have this quest for the origin, but yet were primordially kind of signaling to the origin. The origin is not there, but the signs of the origin were kind of referenced in some ways. So therefore, they were looking for the sacred for that reason. And they were, in many ways, they knew that on the one hand, and Terry talked more about this, the electronic, Marshall McLuhan, the electronic era sort of pushed us away from this sacred, the sacred that was based in mythology, But also monolithic religions were not tolerant of pagan sacred. And then the monolithic religion themselves, they were also, their sacred, whether it is from the Vatican or other places, were undermined by capitalism, undermined by the digital era, but also because they weren't shared. A sacred has to be shared. as we know about the sacred in communities, it is something, whether it is a totem, it has to be shared. And both the major monolithic religion were not in favor of sharing their sacred. You have to do it their way, or you can't do it. I think this happened to music too. Until the event of the jazz, uh, music really was tied to identities, whereas jazz can be shared by everyone. And because jazz can be shared, the music that came after jazz can also be shared. So helped us to share our own private music with other people. Otherwise, music was sacred, liturgical. You have to belong to the group to enjoy music. The sacred was used the same way. So uh, in some sense, we could say that the sacred in this new definition against filiation, against rootedness, against even nationalism, was an event advanced mostly by the Surrealists and the Afro-diasporic writers at first. Because in Africa, I'll talk a little bit about this. If you look at the sacred in Africa, it was confined to groups, to ethnic groups, the Dogons, the Bambaras, the Igbos, the Benin people. They have their sacred, and it was not usually shared. But actually, when you look into Africa itself, as I will try to show, the sacred could be deconstructed and made shareable. So we come to one could say in the beginning that the sacred makes sense for the Afro-diasporic groups, Brazil, the US, Cuba, Haiti, and so on, because of the Atlantic crossing in many ways, which took away the languages from them, took their clothes, took their names, and I'm talking about the Atlantic crossing, which the brutality of which you're very well familiar with, where people are just dumped the bottom of the ships to be shipped to the US. So in that sense, they could no longer rely on filiation for one thing. Filiation in a sense of, I am a Soninke, I come from this area, my parents were like this, and this become the basis of my legitimacy. Europeans do the same thing, from your tribe in Europe, this filiation enables you to legitimize yourself. The Afro-diasporic groups, at least for a long time, did not have the luxury of tracing this filiation. So they have to begin to create the memory of the sacred in a different way. And this is why Glissant liked to say that our literatures are literatures of traces. And then David Hammond, that I will talk about a little bit here also, like to say that we had to invent, we were not like Ashantis that could trace their ancestors way back. We had to invent our own inheritance. That's why we call ourselves Sun Ra. That's why we call ourselves Duke Ellington. We become dukes because we name ourselves dukes. We, monk because we name ourselves like that. So they had to begin this invention, but how the invention traces to the primordial was very, very important to many of the Afro-diasporic writers. Now, landscape is very important to them. Glissant says in Philosophie de la Relation, and I just want to read the beginning of that to give you a sense of how important the landscape is. When I look back, it's because I think this boy is going to wake up, but so far he's okay. He says something like l'homme moderne a redécouvert ses paysages. The modern man has rediscovered their landscape. Il a senti la menace mortelle et a crié la pollution. They felt the threat, the deadly threat of a deadly threat, and they screamed pollution. And in many ways, what happened is that I think he's gonna be okay.
Oh, he's gonna.
Okay, all right. So we have a little baby here who is into his own thing. He was very quiet when the mom was speaking, and suddenly become the source of a problem. But Glissant, this is important. It's important to Glissant to reveal to us. It's not just the transatlantic slave trade that killed the sacred, but the Caribbean today not being able to use their landscape as a character, as a totem, as a jungle, in the way that Terry was talking about in Wilfredo Lam's work, is a problem for the Caribbean, because in many ways, what Glissant says in this long quote, but I just translated 2 lines. What he's saying is that when the nature dies, when nature dies, humanity also dies with it. This is what Glissant is saying, because you find the sacred in nature. So, I mean, oh, I got to undo this, and I need.
So I think we have to share the screen again.
Thought they were all going together.
That I'm not sure what we have.
Okay, I can hold it. You come here.
Yeah, so we're on the shared screen. There you go.
So Glissant is here in Martinique, Fort-de-France, in front of a monument by Laurent Vallière, who that Glissant actually asked. He asked for this monument to be built and to be painted white, which is the symbol of death. But he said nature is going to change the colors as time passes, because in this specific space here in Martinique, when slavery was abolished, a boat there was a shipwreck here, and slavery was abolished, so the plantation owners could not capture people and say, these are our slaves. But at the same time, they were Black, and because they were Black, they wouldn't, they had no title to landing on this space here. So Glissant tells that story, and then wanted Laurent Vallière to build a monument here, which would be a sacred monument to commemorate the people who were shipwrecked in this particular place here. Now, when we were doing the paper, one day we were in Los Angeles and driving, and we came to a place where a cow ran over a squirrel and killed the squirrel. And I just didn't know. You could see the fresh blood, you could see everything. I looked at Terry, she looked at me. We were very moved by this. And we went home. We went home, and the following day, there was a squirrel in the balcony, on the terrace. It was eating in the plant pots and so on. And then I looked at it, and the idea of the dead squirrel came to mind. And then the second day, the squirrel came again. And so the question was, is this the squirrel that we saw dead, or is this another squirrel, or they are one and the same? Become really important to us at that point. And then as I said, you know, my totem in my country was the crocodile. So my mom will tell me all the time that a crocodile will never harm you because it's your totem. Then we begin to call this squirrel our totem in a sense. That's how the squirrel become a totem, because the squirrel is part of modernity. So I'm not going back to Mali to find my totem. I'm finding my totem in the city, in a city park. In this modern area, where is the totem? If we were to do the totem. So this was one of the things that happened to us. And of course, the biggest problem was moving from Los Angeles to New York. What's going to happen to the totem? Then again, we have to find another totem. So this is very important in the kind of definition of the sacred that Glissant is trying to get at. Because he always say, you know, accidents are the best, are the most fertile grounds for poetry. Because, you know, like coronavirus, for example, like COVID-19. But with accidents like our squirrel, you can create poetry. You can have a sacred language in many ways. So this was important to me. And another example that stuck with me was because I know we have time issues here, move faster, was last October, I had a trip with a friend of mine, David Hammond, to Paris. And, you know, if you know Paris at all, you know, I hope some of you do. You know, the intersection of Raspail and Montparnasse, and they have Rue Jules Chaplin, Barbin, Rue de Landes. So you have this crossroad, like, you know, the Caribbean, again, love to talk about crossroads, you know, Anansi and so on. So we were sitting in one cafe, restaurant, Le Dôme, and looking at La Rotonde on the other side of the street. And suddenly a big, huge white plastic bag just flew in the middle of the street. And this plastic bag flew in the middle of the street, and people kept walking around it. No one picks it up. They keep walking, circumventing it. They keep going in different directions. And at that point, David just said, look, look, look. Look at this. Now, this is the best canvas any artist could do. It's the best shot any filmmaker could do. You know, so the buses were coming, some people were coming out of the subway, the people who were walking, they were also going. And so the paper, you know, the wind was blowing the plastic and the people were going around it. And at some point, one person finally decided to drag it out of the middle of the street and put it in a garbage bin. And David said, that's the human being. The other people have stopped being human beings. So there was a sacred moment there that we couldn't do anything about. So I will talk very quickly about Africa. You know, in 1996, I was making a film on Jean Rouge. And Jean Rouge said to me something that I listened to it, but I didn't read. He said, with the Dogons, the sacred really has nothing to do with myth. The sacred is something that you make yourself. For example, the Dogon, he told me, the Dogon, when they're dancing, a mask break, or somebody steal a mask, they just go and cut wood, fresh wood, and make another mask. And once they perform with it, it becomes sacred right away. Now, I listened to this. Jean Rouch was my teacher, but I went to, yeah, Mambi. So I went to make a film on the Dogons in 2000. So and to make a film on the Dogon in 2000, and they were dancing with this mask that we call the Kananga mask. They go around and they bend and the Kananga, the tip just sweep the floor and so on. And they basically are making the sky touch the earth. That's the dance they're doing. When they finished dancing, I went to the chief of the Dogons. I said, can I buy one of the masks that you performed with? I knew I was doing something really bad, but to my biggest surprise, he just pulled it out and sold it to me. Then I realized that Jean Rouch had told me exactly that. One mask break, you just make another one. And when you perform, the mask becomes authentic all over again. Now, that's almost sacrilegious in art history because they have cut off dates in African art. They say any African art after 1950, 52 is not authentic. But the Dogons are still making the art every day. And they are still considered one of Africa's most authentic artists and so on. So the plastic bag, this is another artist in Senegal, in Guinea. I went to see him. As Picasso has this kind of collection, so I wanted to have one mask like that. So I just asked my friend to make me a mask like this, and I have it hanging somewhere here. And the David Hammond, this is the plastic bag that I was describing earlier. It just was flown into the middle of the street, and everybody began to just walk around it instead of removing it. So I know there is a time issue. I'm gonna stop here, Nemaja, if that's okay. And I'll go find Terry and we have a discussion. Yo, Terry. I get the baby. I think when I stop talking, he will stop crying. I knew that. It's okay. All right.
You may want some more of that.
Okay. We'll look at the movie here. All right. So we said.
All right, Manthia, thank you so much. We have one question from Ruth Ann Kim, and Nemanja is going to unmute you, Ruth Ann. This is Pirooz speaking, and you can ask your question.
Okay.
So I'm just wondering if the sacred isn't a search for, well, if it is in some ways for Glissant, a search for traces of origin. And if there is something there related to Marinage, that it has to be traces because there's always this simultaneous dance between fleeing and seeking.
Right.
Can you unpack that a little bit more? Because I'm really curious, because I know he also compares the root of the Native American, who he also says is a rooted culture. And I always know that he tries to separate that, though, from Western rooted culture.
Right, right. Yeah, I think you're right. Glissant actually uses traces, but when he used the word trace, he's opposing trace to roots, to remembering, to something that you can go back to and recollect. He's saying that people who came to the Americas, they lost all those things. So they only remember the traces of things. So you are, I think, walk in agreement with Glissant, but when you want to have the rooted identities and traces of identity, that's what we have to probably try to unpack. How can we be rooted, but at the same time share identities, or at least at the same time become errant, do errantry at the same time. That is, be here but elsewhere at the same time. How could we be in multiple places at the same time? Whereas the literature of traces enable you to do that. The rooted literature, rooted identity would be opposed to that. I don't know if you, okay.
Okay. And right now, I'm just seeing if anybody else has questions. We don't have any on the chat board, but if anyone else has a question, please post something there so I know that you have a question, and then we'll unmute you. Right now, I'm going to see if Professor Finsk has a question as well. Chris, did you have any questions? Yeah, he does. Hold on a second. We're going to.
I can follow up. It's very rich, and I mean incredibly rich. And the movement that you've made, Terry and Manthia, the history that you evoked from Surrealism and Breton forward, and then into this this very contemporary context with the plastic and the squirrels, and I enjoyed that very much. I wonder, I was just, as you were, I feel very sympathetic with what you're doing, very strongly sympathetic. And I've been trying to understand how poetry can engage the landscape in new ways in my own work. But I think that the dimension of surrealism that you're bringing forward is really very important for grasping some of this kind of provisional character of the relation to the sacred that you evoked with the Dogon mask and also with these examples. And I was wondering, as you move through your talk, you sort of moved into the present more from Glissant and then David Hammond. And I wondered, can you carry forward the surrealistic reference a bit more in relation to the contemporary references? I don't know if that's a helpful question, but I just wonder, how is surrealism imposing itself at this point in your thinking here?
Yeah. You go first.
You go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think this is what makes Ted Jones the last, the exquisite corpse, the last man that Terry was talking about, makes Ted Jones very important. First, I mean, in Philosophie de la Relation, Glissant argues, but he states that surrealists and Afro-diasporic writers come into a political consciousness at the same time with regard to the world, in the face of World War II, basically. They come into consciousness and they had a connivance, and they began to, connivance in the Glissantian sense is also like, it looked like dancing together and carrying the same footsteps and then being rhythm together. That's what Glissant meant by connivance. So if you look at somebody like David Hammond, if you look at somebody like Ted Jones, they really wanted to go above the reality that is existent reality that we have in our everyday life, and get into the imaginary. And as they get into the imaginary, I think one could see this in Robin Kelly's book, Freedom Dreams, that Blacks were they were more able to imagine a future for America, the Robin Kelly book. And then Robin basically takes for different writers, Jane Cortez, also Ted Jones, Bob Kaufman, and made the argument that they could, I mean, Afrofuturists also are doing the same thing. You know, the young people group movements now, they are all using surrealism. Some will call it Black surrealism. Some will just call it surrealism or simply call it Afrofuturism. And this, I think the first question was talking, or maybe it's you, Chris, talking about marronage, the maroons. So marronage is a form of surrealism in a way, both in Glissant, but also especially when you look at people like Fred Moten, when you look at contemporary writers. And what they are trying to do is basically fly over the reality that prevails now and attempt to take us somewhere else. And this is what David Hammond said. We were given these names, but we make ourselves kings. We become, you know, Sun Ra. We become, you know, Duke Ellington. We create ourselves. This self-creation is quite important. But why don't you go ahead? Yeah.
No, I think that that's probably a really great elaboration on the point. I think that more and more people are looking to Ted Jones and his legacy to make that connection as he traveled the world and connected with artists all over the place and really started to talk about the connection of surrealism with jazz and surrealism with decolonization efforts and independent African nations, and really had a strong impact on so many artists. I mean, you could speak better than I to the impact on Hammonds of Ted Jones. So this lineage is very direct in terms of what I was talking about earlier with connection, direct connection. I think Jones is really that pivotal figure that moves this into the 21st century.
Yeah, when we're talking about anti-capitalism, you said this in your talk, neoliberalism, but also resistance to certain features. I mean, if you look at even today, Black Lives Matters, these people are very indebted to Black surrealists, because Black surrealists were able to imagine the future in a way that people who were well established in the system had no benefit in imagining it, you know. And I mean, some of them now are talking about not only reforming the police, they're talking about defunding the police. And for a Black middle class, this is insane, because black middle class sometimes are even more in favor of policing than white people. You know, that's the irony. You know? So the surrealists, the Afrofuturists, and the poets definitely were imagining a better future, and to our connection to nature, seeing nature as character, but also to reconnecting with Africa with oral traditions. Because oral tradition, you know, if you look at McLuhan with the electronic revolution, industrialization, the oral tradition, because they were not being written, were relegated to something esoteric. But with the new technologies and the use of these technologies by young rappers, by young hip hop musicians, oral traditions suddenly have become very significant. So the connection and textuality, my generation used intertextuality as opposed to intersectionality, but between surrealism, the new technologies, Afro-diasporic discourses have become very fertile. You know? Yeah.
I think Dan would have a lot to say. But he's wondering who you're speaking to, I think.
was
Yeah,
talking
this
to
puzzled look on his face, which is
I was talking to this dude here.
Pirooz, is there a question there?
Yes, there are many questions, but we're already over time. If we can just have one more question, professors. This is actually from the Facebook live stream. We're getting many questions over there. This is from student Catherine Everett. She asks, do you think Western cultures have their own versions of totems?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. But you go ahead. No, come on. You have to answer.
I want to hear what you have to say about this.
Well, this is what I was trying to say earlier, that we need a new sacred so that it can be shared by everyone. And so if there is, whether you are in Africa or US or Europe or Asia, the new sacred is very relevant, because you are creating something that can be interchangeable, that can be shared by everyone. So it's really, I may have overused Afro-diasporic and Surrealism, but they were the first in the 40s and 50s. Césaire, Breton, they met in Martinique. But today with the Glissants, the struggle is to save the world, not black world or white world. The struggle is, how do we make, to save first the planet, a planetarian vision. Nature has to be preserved. So, and the sacred is what stops people from going to nature and cutting the trees and destroying everything. It has to be preserved. And that's relevant to Western culture. It's relevant to non-Western cultures.
I think it also goes back to what you were saying about the encounter in the city, or these moments of connection and surprise, chance encounter, as Breton would call it, in the urban landscape, and discovering connections to, chance connections to objects that gain sort of a relevance and drive certain forms of creativity. That's very much, again, part of the legacy of Surrealism is the ways in which they're looking to their built environment. Breton's visits throughout the years to the flea market to find objects which carried a sacred significance to him, and which he brought home and reflected on and wrote about, and had Man Ray photograph and put into his books. And a renunciation, again, as we've been saying, of this deadening capitalist system, and this ongoing, very disciplined and beautiful effort to look to something more connective and creative.
He threw his toy away.
If we can do, Manthia and Terry, if we can do one more question. This is from Christopher Zimmerman on our Zoom, and I think that's as much time as we have now for today. And Nemanja is going to unmute you, Christopher, and you can ask your question.
I think I muted myself.
Great.
Thank you. That was really amazing experience. I'm just wondering about this example of the plastic bag.
Yes.
Crossroads. If the person with whom you were with, the person with you were with, said that the only human was he or she who took the plastic and removed it, and I'm wondering if we could sort of venture the opposite interpretation, and that it's really the humans who are avoiding it, and since there's a sense of this
contamination.
Yes, but also this happening that in some ways the person who took the plastic out of that space is kind of destroying the sacred in a way, right? And sort of so attached to this, I'm wondering, I guess fundamentally, about the sort of subjective nature of the sacred. I mean, is it a question of you experiencing this squirrel and the two of you deciding that this is this, or because there is a sense with the sacred of being shared, and I'm just wondering to what extent must there be I don't want to say objectivity, but something that's beyond myself as a thinking subject, that for there to be the sacred.
Right.
Or is it just something that I can fantasize about?
Right. No, two great questions. On the one hand, the person, David Hammond, made 2 or 3 things that I want to repeat first before giving. One was, he said, this is art. Why was that art for him? Because to him, art, the role of art is to disturb the order. So it was disturbing order. That's one thing. And then they Glissant, bringing Glissant and David Hammond together, the plastic bag was symbol of pollution also. And in many African cultures, the sacred is hidden. Let's say if you read a book like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, all the totems, all the idols are hidden in a place called Evil Forest. There's some place, because they contaminate you, the very dangerous things. So there is that on the one hand, but on the other hand, finally, David was upset with the person who removed. He was upset with that person because he wanted us to spend the whole evening there, just looking at how the French people just coming and going around. He wanted us to stay there. And then it was a big disappointment for him when it was finally removed. So the reading that I gave you, it's because I wanted to connect the plastic bag on the one hand to Glissant's notion of pollution, to pollution in our mix. I wanted to do that, but at the same time, how do we find new totems from inanimate objects? Even though this plastic bag was behaving like an animate object because the wind was coming, moving it, and people were avoiding it like it was either a snake or whatever it was. So that that's to put this thing in a larger context. When we go to the other point, subjectivity, objectivity, Glissant approaches that, Glissant's notion of opacity is that I consent to your right to opacity and you consent to my right to opacity, and then we meet. By meeting, and this is the answer to your question, beginning of answer to your question, by meeting, we begin to create a solidarity of opacities or solidarity of intuitions, or collective opacity, collective intuition, and so on. We begin to create that between us. That's why the subjectivity of the the squirrel was personal. Just like the crocodile in my village was personal. But if in big cities today, it could be the squirrel, but it could be interchangeable with a pigeon. It could be interchangeable with some other objects in many ways by looking at Glissant's notion of solidarity, collective unconscious, or whatever you want to look at it. But I think it's the matter of this question really, how do we share totems today? If we are to run away from religious sacred because it's intolerant, if we are to run away, if we make it impossible to share our totems and our sacreds, and now we are in a big city, what are we to do? We are losing our humanity. And we need our humanity. Machines are, especially the digital system is saying, but to be human, you don't need the body because machines can do everything. If you look at the Google ledger, you don't need a body. So we're being told by some people who don't need the body, and we're being told that if we don't have the human, then we have no way of identifying and trembling with the trembling of people who need our solidarity. And we have a lot of people. So on the one hand, the new sacred is a kind of indirect way of defending humanity. Yeah, the new humanities.
Pirooz, shall I?
Yeah, I think that you know, we're already 11 minutes over time.
Let me then thank Manthia and Terry very heartedly, and Daniel for.
I just talk blah 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 blah. So thank you.
No, I one of the things I was thinking as you were speaking at the end is that you know, sharing is about it takes many forms, you know, and it's an issue of a relationality. It's doing poetry. It's happening in the streets to some extent these days, as it did, you know, in other moments. But also in the way you've been conveying it. You know, it's a form of teaching also and sharing. So, thank you so much, both of you, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah.
Maybe in a more live way. I want to hold that, John. Anyway. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for participating.
Thank you all for participating in this and indulging with us.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will post this entire video up on our YouTube page, and the Facebook live stream will also be there. So thank you all. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.